Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. Phelim McDermott co-founded acclaimed theatre company Improbable 20 years ago. He has directed plays, operas and musicals for the West End, Broadway, English National Opera, New York's Metropolitan Opera and others, with credits including Shockheaded Peter with Julian Crouch and the Tiger Lillies, Philip Glass's The Perfect American, The Addams Family on Broadway, and most recently Jim Broadbent in A Christmas Carol in London. An older improvisation-based Improbable show, Animo, was revived for the 2016 Latitude Festival, led by co-artistic director Lee Simpson. I asked Phelim how this show first came about.
It's kind of interesting, Animo, because actually, although our first sort of fully funded show was a show called 70 Hill Lane, as Improbable, sort of unofficially, or in reality, Animo was the first Improbable show that ever happened. And it came about partly because I'd had this thing happen where I'd been teaching puppetry, doing workshops with puppetry, using puppetry in shows. And very often I'd been like, wow, these puppeteers are really great when they're improvising. And then you'd have to go through that process where you've done it once and then they have to sort of relearn how they did what they'd done and so on. But I kind of thought it'd be really, because we did lots of improv shows and had been doing them already for many years, thought it'd be really interesting to put puppetry on stage in an improv show as well. And it was kind of strange at that time because the one thing that you never did when you put a show on was mention the word puppetry.
Yes.
Ever. It was like the dirty word of sort of theatre. It was up there with kind of mime as a sort of what's this thing. And also, if we were going to do an improv show that was puppetry, we go, well, it's improv. It's not for kids. Although we did do a kids version. We wanted to make sure we didn't sort of scare adults away. So at that point, we never mentioned puppetry. So we ended up calling it different things like object animation. Sounds it's like the slightly ashamed thing that people who, I don't know, have sex shops where they call it a private shop.
Yes.
It's a horrible euphemism. But we wanted for people to know that it was for adults, because we might be improvising and swearing. You never know. Could happen. But it was that thing of wanting to explore the connections between the two things. We'd always been doing improv that was more about theatre than it was necessarily about being sort of comedy improv, as it were. Which there was, of course, there was a lot of that then. Whose Line was happening. The Comedy Store Players with Lee who's doing that then.
Which she's still doing.
Still doing, yes. They traced the lineage right to where it is.
Yes.
So we just got into little studios in places like BAC, and we would get a little team of puppeteers together and a team of improvisers, and then sort of set off and see where those two things joined up, exploring that kind of in-between space, I guess, which a lot of our work does, I would say. That's kind of very often it's hard to find a sort of through line to what we've done because we've done such varied things. And actually the through line is that we've picked one thing, picked another, and gone, what happens in between those two things?
Yeah. I have seen puppet improv, I think probably since you started doing Animo. The Henson Company has been doing Puppet Up for quite a few years now. And
right.
They had a kids show which they cancelled because exactly what you said. They can't guarantee that. It's really hard when you're improvising to judge it for a kid's audience, I would imagine. But also you mentioned Lee Simpson. You've got up there who's very experienced as an improviser in the Whose Line tradition. But this is very different to any of that. They're not conventional puppets, and it's not the Whose Line type improv games, is it? This is more of a long form. So how do you work that into it, and how do you rehearse a show like that?
I mean, like most improv shows, the rehearsal process is you just do it. So you get in a room and you do it like you might be doing it. And what we first discovered with Animo that was interesting was that if you started off the show by doing some like tabletop puppetry.
Yeah.
And I'd been doing a lot of work with newspaper and animating newspaper. If you started this improv show off with two people sitting behind pieces of paper and then slowly they bring them to life and they might turn into something.
Yeah.
Sometimes that'd be amazing. Sometimes it'd be a little bit weird and a bit rubbish.
Yeah.
Because that's the gig. But what we did discover was that once you push that sort of stall out as an idea, the audience were then much happier to watch slower scenes where people took a little bit more time, scenes that weren't necessarily funny. So if we'd done some puppetry like that initially at the start of the show, there was a kind of clear contract that you could do different. It opened up some space to do different kinds of scenes that weren't necessarily funny, scenes where people might wait, scenes where it might be serious. And it's not that because actually, if you go out and do an improv show, you can't help yourself but be gravitating towards laughs.
Yeah.
But it just opened up some new possibilities, and it seemed like new and interesting territory for us. Yeah. So having done that first scene, we would then jump somewhere else, and we'd go, well, we'll do a puppetry scene, then we'll just start off another scene that is a scene of two people, and we might get suggestions or we might not. And usually we'd find ourselves getting suggestions at the beginning of the show and only going back to the audience for suggestions maybe 2/3 of the way through, or when we'd got sort of 40 minutes in and we still had 10 minutes to go and we'd say, what should we do now? Yeah. And we'd then do an acting scene, and then you'd basically jump between different worlds. So it's kind of it's a bit like plate spinning. You set one going, which is puppetry, then you set another scene, which is people acting, and then you might even do something like dance, or movement. And then once you've set those out, you can then jump between each of those, and you might do a totally different puppet scene, or you might pick up the story that you started in the first scene, or you might revisit, once you've done the acting scene, go back to puppetry, then revisit that. So it basically became a way of, and then you'd kind of try and hold off joining them up. Yeah. And then hope the improv gods sort of smiled on you and they joined themselves up in a way that you never quite expected.
And how satisfying does that feel when it works?
It's really a kind of beautiful thing, because what happens is afterwards no one quite knew what happened. Yeah. And I don't know if it is that people who write sometimes say, suddenly once in their life they get this moment where a story appears fully formed. Yeah. They write it all down and go, where did that come from? It's a little bit like that. Slightly enjoyable, slightly spooky sometimes, because if you look back at it, you go, wow, there's all these connections I never even thought of, that if it was like someone sitting down and doing sort of narrative structure lessons, they'd go, let's join that up with that. So it was really, really enjoyable. And it was really enjoyable that there could be atmospheric scenes. And then the other element of it was this thing. So when we first did it, we were working with Julian Crouch, who's a designer and mask maker. And he had a fantasy about actually sort of making on stage in front of an audience. And he would talk about, I've got this image of myself getting up and making masks or making stuff. It's not quite a great analogy now, but he used to talk about like watching Rolf Harris doing his paintings, actually people enjoying the process of seeing it made. And so he started doing a thing where he would like get one of us on a chair and he'd build a mask on our heads. And then he'd build another one. And then a scene would happen. And that, we discovered a lot of things from that, basically about how much the audience enjoyed watching the nuts and bolts of something being made. Yeah.
That happened at...
did they do a mask?
Latitude. They did. They finished, they had a bit of time left, so they finished building a mask. Yeah. And they actually went with... they didn't take that many suggestions from the audience after the first scene, but... a young child in the audience shouted out, it looks like a snowman. So they went with that and they made him into, it was quite a moving scene. There wasn't much funny about it, about a snowman who was melting.
Well, they're kind of, They're interesting masks because, again, a bit like puppets.
Yeah.
They work from there being a bit of space around them and people reading into them. So that was very enjoyable. And then we kind of widened that out, so we started getting more of a kit. So I can remember once at BAC, someone said, "What do you want to see on the stage?" And they said, "Oh, Venice." Wow. Okay. Basically, in about sort of 10 minutes, out of cardboard and all the rubbish we built Venice. And of course, it was sort of rubbish, but also kind of brilliant. And in the audience's imagination, it was better than any set that we could have done that was a detailed replication of Venice. Because there's a contract there, which is that this is make-believe, it's what theatre's about, you will imagine Venice. So then, of course, we did a scene with a gondolier. I'm sure there was some kind of love story in there, no doubt. But this thing of watching things being made became quite a big part of our vocabulary for that show, of course, because we explored it, and then for other shows as well. So 70 Hill Lane, where I made my own house sort of on stage with sellotape and newspaper.
Yes.
And then we ended up doing that, sort of led to a production of Midsummer Night's Dream, where the fairies made the fairy bowers, and they were like insects from sellotape. And it's a really interesting thing, because as a performer, when you're making on stage, there is a sort of like idea that you've got to get it over with so that it can start. And actually, the process of seeing someone build a mask or glue something together really fast is really, it's really enjoyable.
Yeah, like you say, it's the instinct, particularly coming from the improv tradition where you're chasing a laugh, and if you don't get a laugh within a few seconds, then you jump to the next thing.
Exactly, yes.
Goes back to Keith Johnstone and his theatre sports, I suppose, isn't it? Where if something's boring, they get gonged off.
Well, it's interesting that, because actually Keith says, there's a couple of things that Keith says that are interesting about that. First is, he says, most of my teaching can be replaced by a tape recorder in the corner of the room saying, slow down. And just every now and again it goes, slow down. And he says that's most of my teaching. But the other thing is he does a thing where when people are coming out and trying to be funny, trying to be, I guess it's that thing where people are slightly needy. He says he does it secretly first. He gives the performers an instruction, and then they go on stage and you go, oh, they've immediately got more interesting. I wonder what he said. And actually what he said is go out there and try and aim to bore the audience. He said, don't try and be boring, but bore the audience. And as soon as you try and bore the audience, you immediately get more interesting.
Yeah.
It's like a kind of paradox. And basically it's because it gets rid of that, the desperation to be interesting, which is one of the biggest things, you know.
Yeah, he says some fascinating things, Keith Johnstone. I think Impro is one of the most read books on my bookshelf.
Must be, yeah. It's an amazing book. And he because it was 1985, I did a 10-day course with him in Monkton Wild in Dorset. And it basically changed my sort of life, really changed my sort of theatre practice, because it just relieved me of that thing of everything's got to be perfect, everything's got to be good, and it just opened up a whole area it opened up that territory that I was talking about earlier, like we were doing with puppetry. Yeah,
and your work over the years has covered many different types of theatre. You've done West End, Broadway musicals, you've done plays, you've done Shakespeare, you've done opera. I've seen an interview with you where you sort of prided on yourself that people find it difficult to categorise the work that Improbable does. But, I mean, Improbable has been going for 20 years now. So when you're looking back, do you think you could find a thread that goes between all of those different types of work?
I mean, impro is the thread, in the sense that even if you're working on a play with text, there's an intention to keep it alive, play it differently. So I just did a Christmas show, a Christmas Carol with Jim Broadbent in the West End. And I discovered this technique by a guy called Jeremy Whelan, which is a way of, basically it's a way of learning lines without ever having books in your hand standing up. So you record the text, play it back, and the actors get up in the space, and it's a little bit like dubbing scenes. You're free to move straight away because your text is being played for you. So you're not worrying about remembering the lines.
Yeah.
And what it means is basically the performers improvise straight away. And they're interacting and acting straight away. Then you record it again. You're not allowed to do anything the same way. You have to do it totally differently. And there's a whole sequence of 5 recordings. And then when they've done it 5 times, different ways, different games each time, you say, now, okay, just do the scene. And the performers go, I've not learned my lines. And you go, well, see how many of your lines you do remember. Trust that you do. And generally, I would say people remember like 75 to sometimes 100% of the lines without ever having sat down and learnt them.
Yeah.
And they've got used to playing them in different ways. And that basically embeds an intention and a culture that you're improvising even with text, which is, one of the reasons Jim asked me to direct that show was we'd worked with him on Theatre of Blood at the National, and we used that technique, and he just loved it. It was like, water off a duck's back, as they say. He loved being able to play those scenes everywhere, which is what he does anyway. Even if he was to learn a script in a traditional way. So there it is in the text. Even if I go into an opera situation, I'm trying to get them to be even if they're doing the same things every night. You're going, how do you do that with a sensibility where it is different every night? And that's there in all the work, I would say. Even stuff that's where you have to go, this is really dangerous. Unless you do this, something might drop on your head because there's a crane above you. There's a playfulness and a kind of an intention to use play as a way of going, of course, to be funny, but also a way of going deeper. So it's sort of sometimes frustrating when you're talking to funding bodies.
Yes.
You say, what is it you do? And you go, well, we do something different every time. But that is there. There's a kind of a bedrock thing, which is that we think theatre and performance is a live event. So it should do what we think it does best, which is really embrace what it is and be as alive as possible. And all that work over the years sits on different points of that spectrum, but it's a spectrum of basically how do you keep it alive and how do you keep it something that's vital, that keeps audiences engaged.
So do you have a process for starting on a production or choosing a new production? If it's so varied, how do you decide what to do next, and how do you actually sit down and start creating it?
Interesting one. Well, it's kind of hard when you're an NPO. I don't know if you know about that. That's a National Portfolio Organisation for those, which basically means we get a period of funding for, say, 4 years, and you have to give a plan in as a National Portfolio Organisation of what you're going to do in the year. So you say, well, we're going to do this show, and in that you think, well, we'll do a big one, a small one, something that we've never done before. And so you sort of make a plan, and then the reality happens, and you find out you didn't quite manage to get that funding or fit that match with that venue, and then this is happening. But if you were to say, what would we like to do? I'd say the things we're thinking of are maybe do something different from what we just did, and then see if you can listen to what's alive in yourself as an impulse for something that hasn't quite sort of been given space yet. And that's a little bit harder to do, I think, because you have to create a space to think about that and let something emerge. So we've got a list of, on the wall, we've got a list of all these kind of crazy projects. And some of them you look at and go, will that ever happen? And then suddenly, sort of a year later, there's something has come about which makes it seem right that project actually might happen. And it may be a conversation with someone, or you've met a performer, and you think, they'd be brilliant to be in it. And you talk to them. So then they get talked into being in a way. And basically, I guess the simple answer to that question is we're following our nose, albeit a nose made out of latex foam that's been built on you.
But like you say, that's a hard thing to put on a funding application, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think now people should be able to see the story and be able to sort of go, well, there is a through line to it. But, you know, each time you visit it, you go, oh, having to persuade people that impro is interesting again, or that it's not just that, as it were. It's not just the Who's Line thing. Yeah. It's something like Animo, or, you know. We do another show called Bastille, and that's a show which came out of a frustration of how long it took projects to happen. And that's me and Lee and my wife, Matilda. And basically what we do is we get in a room for a week with someone outside of performance. And at the end of that week, we have to do 3 improvised shows. Right. So we've done one with a provocative therapist. We've done one with a medieval potter, a guy who recreates pots in a medieval fashion on an old pottery wheel, an astrologist, climate change expert. And as we hang out with them for a week, at the end of that week, we just do some improvised shows. And sometimes they end up on stage with us, doing some therapy for us. on us, and then we do improvised scenes, and again, a bit like Animo, you find out what's in between those worlds, and that's because I'm interested in this, I'm interested in that. It'd be really great to do a show, but the idea of trying to make that happen can be a 2-year process. But actually, you go, let's just do it.
I saw an interview recently with Colin Mockery, who's famous for the American Who's Line, and he's doing a show in Edinburgh at the moment where he works with a hypnotist.
Oh, great.
And the hypnotist hypnotises members of the audience, and then he has to improvise scenes with these people who believe it's real because they've been hypnotised. Now, that sounds like the sort of thing you're talking about. Is there a fear of repeating yourself, or is there a constant need to challenge yourself and not get stuck in a rut of doing the same things?
I mean, I guess there's 2 elements to that. The first is, yes, you go, oh, let's do something else. And then the other is, let's really do that thing that we've been doing for a long time, but really do it. Yeah. So the impulse to go back to Animo is because we know that that's right. You know, you can keep exploring that. I mean, you were saying earlier, it's not like sort of traditional puppets. We might meet a puppeteer, and this has happened sometimes. They've got a load of puppets that are already made, and we go, well, let's just work them into the show and see what happens. So a show that's got like a set of puppets that doesn't happen anymore, those puppets can come back out of retirement and suddenly find themselves performing again, as they sort of, I guess, puppeteers nervous, but they often do end up in other shows and so on. Yeah. But I think it's both those things. And really, each time you do it, you're just trying to push that little edge of, are you on that growing edge of trying to do something a little bit out of your comfort zone? Are you trying to go a little bit deeper? Are you trying to unfold something that's just because that's rewarding? You know, it's great to make people laugh, and you know, and I will be. In fact, tomorrow night I'm doing my first Comedy Store gig for a long time. I'll be at the Comedy Store with Lee, or I might be doing it because he's on holiday. I don't know. I'll find out who. I don't even know who's on. Sorry. It's great to make people laugh, but it's also great to explore those other things, storytelling, narrative, to include lights and all those things. You know, I don't know if you talk to Lee, but we basically, our next big project is a sort of 10-year project, and it's to create an international institute of improvisation. Because we want to create a kind of hub and a centre that connects up all these different improv worlds. And I say it's 10 years because in 10 years there will be a building to house that. And it'll be a building where we'll continue to explore improvised work. Other people can come and make connections with other performers, artists. And it will be a sort of research centre. It'll also be a place where we can do our our kind of forums and our open space events. And it will be a place where all kinds of improvisation can meet, gather together, and create new kinds of improvisation and go deeper with that exploration. Because people who do improv, the one thing that always happens is you find yourself rehearsing in a grubby little room somewhere, desperately trying to find space to do what you do. And that's one of the beauties of it, because you can always do it. If you can't persuade yourself, we haven't got enough money to, you go, well, you can just find a room somewhere and do it. But it would also be nice if there was a home and a place that had some facilities and you could explore other ways of doing it and making it as interesting as it is now, but even more interesting.
Right. So there is a desire to make improvisation, to give it some more status. I suppose because it's associated with comedy, and comedy never has a high status. It's not looked on as being a serious art form. Is that the idea?
It's certainly one of the ideas. You know, I think it was our third show was Life Game, which is a Keith Johnstone format where you interview a guest and you do scenes from their life. And I'd been trying to get funding for that for years. And I'd put applications in to do. I remember applying for the Barclays New Stages Fund.
Oh, yes.
For that.
I do.
I thought, this is really great. No, it is because there was and still is to an extent a prejudice about what improvisation is. So yes is the answer. I think it would be great to give impro a home that gives it some kind of status and a chance to sort of not just sort of make stuff, but reflect on itself and support people who are doing it. I mean, there's a lot more people doing it now than when we were first doing it.
Yeah.
When we were first doing it, Lee will tell you, there was Omelette Broadcasting Company, who he was doing stuff with. There was also Theatre Machine, which was Roddy Mudge Roxby and Ben Benison and Keith's gang, who were still performing, but Keith had gone to Canada. And the people who were actually doing it at that point, you could really count on the fingers of two hands. And since then, it's grown. And if you look, I'm sure you've looked at, I daren't even look myself, look at Edinburgh Fringe programme, and you'll see hundreds of people doing it.
Yes, hundreds.
Yeah. And some of those people are trying to do narrative stuff, and there are different strands of it all over the world, people exploring it in different ways. The whole American lineage of long form and Del Close and Viola Spolin and the British one. And all those sort of veins of exploration are really interesting. It would just be nice if they kind of joined up to one sort of heart, or were given the chance to do that in some ways and find out what we could do together. Now, when we're sort of, who are we to set up the International Institute of Improvisation? We said, but we kind of thought, well, maybe because of our tradition and because we've crossed all these different areas, we're in a position more than most to actually try and make that happen. So we'll see what happens, and we'll try and include all the people who are creating improv in all the worlds, because there's people doing dance improv, there's people doing musical improvisation who don't necessarily see themselves as connected to those other people who are doing stuff at the Comedy Store or doing stuff in Edinburgh. But they could really learn from each other, and I'm sure would enjoy and find that fruitful. So we're going to help support that to happen more.
So that's a long-term project that you and Improbable have got. So what's in the more immediate future for you?
Interestingly enough, the next immediate project is myself and Lee working at the National Theatre Studio, and we are working on a project called Lost Without Words. And interestingly, the origins of that project were that I met an actor who I'd seen when I was young at the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. He was called Trevor Peacock, extraordinary performer. Yeah. And I'd just moved to St Margaret's, and I saw him on a bench, and I went, "Oh my God, that's Trevor Peacock!" And he was a real influence on me as a kid. I saw him with Max Wall do Godot, and Trevor, And he looked at me and said, yeah, how do I know you? I said, well, you don't really. I know you. I saw you at the Royal Exchange and we had this conversation. It's very sweet. And I said, what are you performing? He said, I can't do it anymore. The words won't come. And he was basically talking about memory, and that's an issue, as is for some performers. And that little zeitgeist that happened of actors discussing the fact that they were not going on stage because it was harder to learn their lines became a thing that Lee and I were discussing. And I said to Lee, it's crazy. We've been teaching people improv for over 25 years. There aren't any lines to learn. They could still be performing.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that at one of our board meetings, and Stephen Daldry said, that's great, you should call it Lost Without Words, which was his great contribution to the idea for the show. And the studio have given it, we went and talked to Rufus, and the studio have given us some space, and we've done 2 short workshops already with 5 performers, most of whom were in their, say it quietly, in their 80s. Uh-huh. We did reject one actress, and we're happy to say, I'm sorry, we're rejecting you because you're in your early 70s, you're too young. And generally, it's widened out. There are lots of reasons elder actors don't perhaps perform on stage as much. It might be lines. It might be that it's just too tiring to do 8 shows a week in the West End. Yeah. But we got a small, beautiful gang of performers together, and we've been quietly, and it's a sort of little secret project at the moment, quietly doing improv with them. And it's just been the most wonderful, beautiful thing. And they're all people who have not done improv before, really. They're all, as it were, traditional actors and actresses. And we've been doing improv. So our next iteration of that will be next year, at the beginning of the year. And it will be, I was doing some more work at the studio. We'll be doing some one-off gigs, secret gigs in above pubs and in fringe spaces. And then it will culminate in us performing on someone else's stage at the Dorfman Theatre, was the Cottesloe, now the Dorfman, in the afternoons. And we will be working with our wonderful elders of the improv world and doing an improvised show.
For more information about Improbable, see www.improbable.co.uk. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.